Welcome to the End Hiring Podcast. Thank you for joining us, Harsh. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, happy to be here. I'm glad we could finally make time. Used to work at Google as an engineer, and then I left to do a startup which was acquired by Pinterest. Worked at Pinterest for a couple of years, and then now I run an online boot camp for technical interviews called the Interview Camp. So we train engineers to get jobs at Google, Facebook, FANG companies. On the side, I also advise companies in India for tech hiring, like growing their engineering teams, helping them out with setting up the interview process and pretty much anything related to hiring. Yeah,
Got it.
that's what I do right now.
So, just to clarify, is Interview Camp also based around India or is it a more global enterprise?
No, Interview Camp is completely online. It's global. Yeah, we have customers. Most of our customers are in the U.S. Like 80% are U.S. The rest of them are everywhere in the world.
Got it. So, it seems like you have one foot in the US market with Interview Camp, but you also are doing all this advising in India for startups. How did that happen?
Yeah, so I was pretty much in the U.S. for 12 years, and then I finally, Interview Camp was in the US, and then a couple of years ago, I decided to move back to Asia, and so I moved to Singapore. Moving there opened me up to this whole new world of Asian tech companies and the rocket ship growth that's going on there. And so part of it was, I was pulled into helping out different companies.
Got it. Yeah. So this is what I think many folks in the US are interested in. I think many folks in Asia also are interested in, which is like there are distinct startup scenes. So you mentioned Singapore and India. Have you sort of come across any other ones that you're just sort of seeing take off like a rocket ship?
Startup scenes, yeah. So Indonesia is taking off quite a bit. Indonesia, it's a huge market. It's like 300 to 400 million people, largest country in Southeast Asia. A lot of movement happening there. Um, Singapore is like in a weird place where it's like the central hub for Southeast Asia. So a lot of companies are incorporated there. A lot of headquarters are in Singapore for Southeast Asian companies. So, but all around Southeast Asia, you see a lot of activity happening. A lot of new unicorns coming up, a lot of new startups being started, and of course, India. In India, that's activity is probably like 2 or 3x, or maybe even 5x of Southeast Asia. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting you mentioned that Singapore is sort of the hub of this region of Southeast Asia, and headquarters are there. But do people hire engineers there?
Yeah, that's a good point. They do hire engineers there, although more and more companies are starting to set up like tech engineering offices in India. Um,
Mhm.
so Bangalore and Gurgaon are probably the two main cities in India that come to mind. For example, I believe the Indonesian, decacorn, the name is slipping out. The Gojek,
Gojek.
right?
Yeah.
Gojek, they have a huge tech office in India. I think multiple tech offices at this point. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think the trend now is, try to hire, set up a tech team in India. That's slowly happening. Another place that's really popular now is Vietnam.
Mhm.
So Vietnam has a lot of tech talent, and so some companies are also setting up
Mhm.
offices there. Right now, Vietnam's more of a sort of like a freelancing, consulting slash outsourcing hub, but I think slowly companies are starting to set up offices there.
This is interesting because you're making it sound like it's a new thing to set up offices in India, right? But that's been the case, right? Like, haven't hasn't outsourcing been a big thing for a while already?
Yeah, that's a really good point. You're right. You're absolutely right. So outsourcing has been around forever, right? We have huge outsourcing companies in India that are like tens of billion dollars in valuation. I think what's new is that these outsourcing companies served as back offices for, your companies, your foreign companies, like U.S. companies or Singapore companies. Um, Now, though, the offices that companies are setting up, they are like the core offices, right? they're part of the company instead of a back office that you outsource something into. So they're so that's changed a bit from the past.
Interesting. So is it, would you say it's sort of like going from a cost center, being this like reduced cost center, to now being like the profit center, right? Where technology is actually like seen as being a core part of Gojek's product, right?
Yeah, yeah, I would say that. Yeah, and I will give a shout out to like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, these tech companies. They really started this, right? Everyone was outsourcing, but these companies went ahead and set up like tech offices in India. And for a long time, these were the only companies which had core tech offices there. Everyone else was outsourcing.
Mm.
But now, yeah, we see it. We see a change. These are not just cost centers. These are also, you're right, exactly, profit centers.
So there was like the old outsourcing stuff, which was, perhaps like more enterprise driven and whatever. And then now we're starting to see a bit more just product development and maybe even like B2C businesses bringing their hunger for technical talent to India. And it's not just Western companies doing this anymore, it's Indonesian companies and Singaporean companies. What's this done to the hiring market in India?
Yeah, yeah. So the hiring market, as a result, when a company is setting up their core office there, outsourcing used to be like a cost thing for them. That that's a place where we can get things done at a much cheaper cost. With a core office, though, that's less of a case. You want some really good quality work to be done, and so you want the best talent in the country. And so what this has led to is a war, a giant war for talent. You know, Sadly, the Indian education system is not living up to creating really talented engineers. In fact, there's studies after study would say that just right out of college, engineers are not ready for good coding jobs. So as a result, the amount of talent that can do these jobs is a lot less compared to the demand for them. And so we see like, yeah, salary is going up quite a bit, and a lot of competition.
Do you have a theory as to like why the Indian education system is broken in this particular respect? I mean, I think we've both gone through enough of it to know that like our success might be despite it, not because of it. Um, but like, do you have a personal theory of why, like, where the gap is basically? Why isn't the education system correcting itself?
Yeah, it's one of those institutions, like it's one of those industries that's, really old, and nothing wrong with being old, but it's broken everywhere, right? Everyone, everywhere, every country thinks their education system is broken. India, there's a specific problem, textbook like it's all about exams, and there's a huge culture of cracking exams, and there's a lot less hands-on work, which you do require for a software engineering degree, right? You require hands-on work. You require people to get into computer labs and build software. That in India is done after college, right? And I'm not talking about the top institutions. I'm sure the top 1 or 2% of institutions in India are great, but I'm talking about the vast majority, right? There was some study which said, like, I think less than 5% of engineers in India were employable. I'm not sure what the study was. You can find it online. And it's really because of the lack of hands-on experience that our college students have. There's just less hands-on experience. Once they enter the industry, they have the opportunity to learn. But again, that depends on if their job teaches them good skills, right? A lot of, for example, jobs that are not very high tech perhaps, but they're called software engineers. Like, a lot of times even you and me have seen that new grads might be given some really shallow work, like, just updating documentation or fixing some shallow bugs, and that typically doesn't lead to people really learning how to build software, right? So yeah, those are, I think, the main reasons.
Yeah, that's really interesting insight. It does bring to mind that I've also seen some employers give exams as a part of the interview process, right? Which feels like a kind of continuation of what you're saying is broken about the original education system. It's like you might actually filter for a bunch of people who are just really good at taking exams, and then you give them an exam again for the interview, and then they ace that as well because they're good at taking exams, but they don't actually know how to code.
And I think that's a problem with, I'm sure that's a problem not just in India, but in many regions around the world, right? Yeah,
Yeah, no,
absolutely.
I definitely hear that. I think it's the exam thing is maybe a remnant of when there were many people applying for a job, and and you needed to sort of cut down on the number of people somehow. And the exam was just like an arbitrary filter you threw up, and then whoever got through, you would continue the interview process from there. But now it's, if there's truly a war for talent, I assume that things like this are going away, right? That the hiring process is shifting in some way.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It's totally a remnant of when, jobs were scarce and like there were, hundreds of applicants per job. So you just had to like figure out, just an easy way to filter them. Yeah, it's a really easy filter, right? Just put 100 people in a room and give them like a sheet of paper with multiple choice tests, and then let them figure it out, and then the top guy wins, right? Top guy or girl. Yeah.
How have you seen this war for talent kind of play out? If not, if people aren't just changing their methods, what else are they doing to try to get talented people to come work for them?
Yeah, so there's many different things happening in Asia in general. One thing we see is that, how if you've interviewed at like a Google or it's, many tech companies, like their interview process drags on for a while, so it might be a month before you hear back from them. One thing we're seeing in Asia in specific is like really quick interview process times. So if a candidate comes in, like you want to, close the interview process in 1 week ideally, right? That's something companies are really pushing for, because in that 1 week someone else could give that offer and the candidate could, commit to joining them. So like speeding up the whole interview process has been um, a byproduct of this, which I think it's good, right? No one wants to hear, no one wants to wait for a month to hear back from a company, and because in that time you could have joined another company. So that's one thing companies are doing. So another thing they're doing, there's some companies that are doing crazy things like giving out BMW motorcycles and stuff. You hear that in the news as sort of like publicity tactics. Some companies
Fascinating.
who are doing that. um, but I think at the end of the day, it all comes down to pay, right? And it all comes down to how much salary benefits they're offering. And so I think over the past 2 years, I wouldn't be like at any like top VC funded startup or a large company, Indian based company, salaries have gone up 50% or maybe even more. So and that's a crazy thing, right? Doubling the salary within 2 years is not unheard of. It's very common. In fact, in India, there's these outsourcing companies, right? And they're well known for paying less money. So when one of the really major achievements for engineers in India is, if you're already working at an outsourcing company where you're paid less, you want to jump to like a hot startup or a hot unicorn, right? Um, and that jump ends up resulting in like 5 to 6x, anywhere from like 4 to 10x of their current salary, right? Which is just crazy, right? Imagine if like overnight your salary went up 5x, right?
That is really nuts, actually. So, I mean, then there's basically no linear progression between those two ranges, right? Like that's the first thing that's interesting, right? Which is that there's sort of this tier, this tier one, which is the consulting salaries, and then like the next tier above is not like double the salary. It's like a significant multiple on top of that. And this sort of skill gap of how do you get from one to the other seems like that's probably not so easily navigable. Otherwise, more people would be jumping, and then the market would become sort of more naturally equilibrate down in price.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. You're right. Yeah. So like, yeah, if everyone could have made that jump, the market would have gone down in price. You're right. You're right. Absolutely right. And I think that it comes down to like engineers. Like India has so many engineers. I believe we graduate 400,000 engineers every year or so. Um, and it kind of comes down to training, right? Why aren't we training these engineers to work at these top companies? And so there's a new industry formed that's formed in the past couple of years, which is really, sort of like your Lambda schools, um, but Indian versions of those, where they take students from who are already working perhaps at a company that perhaps they want to switch jobs. uh, these companies, these boot camps, then train them for like 3 to 6 months, and they give them some projects and skills, and then they get them ready to apply for these upper tier companies. Now, this is different from the U.S. In the U.S., like Lambda School is about career switching. So, coders, people who are not coders, learning how to code and switching companies. In India, it's more about kind of um, company switching, right? Or tier switching. You want to move from a company that's perhaps not paying you as much, and a boot camp will come in and place you into a company that's in a higher tier.
That is really interesting. There's so I feel like a bit of this fits into what you were saying earlier too about, you know, companies trying to close a deal really fast, like close a hire really fast, like just get somebody in within a week, and being very aggressive about that. And so, like when I hear that they're trying to do this evaluation process really quickly, they're kind of trying to figure out like, okay, can this person start work and basically become productive immediately? And if they're looking at this like tier of outsourcing companies and the people coming out of there, they probably don't feel like those people can come in and just start working from day one, right? Which is why I imagine that this industry has come up, and then the whole idea is that the industry outputs people who can sort of work from day one. But the my big question to you is that education industry actually working as intended?
I think it's too early to tell. It's too early to tell. The companies in this space, like they'll all claim that like a huge percentage of their students get placed and so on. So it's still too early to tell, I think. One thing is definitely working for them, for these companies, which is that they have more than enough companies coming in to hire the students, right? Because there's so much demand, like they never have problems on the sales side of things. Like they don't struggle to get employers on their platform, because employers are just looking for students. So their bigger struggle is um, training their incoming like engineers and students, and giving them a robust training. So if they crack that right at scale, then they'll probably do pretty well.
That is really interesting. I'm curious if you've heard of this thing called Bloom's two sigma problem.
No, I haven't.
It's an ed tech research finding, which basically says that students who've been given one-on-one coaching, one-on-one tutoring in a particular subject outperform students taught by any combination of other techniques by two standard deviations, right? So one-on-one tutoring is just such an incredibly powerful method of education, and like every study kind of bears this out, right? And what
Really?
we're Yeah, yeah. So what we're trying to do in the ed tech field, what everyone's trying to do in the ed tech field is find that combination of tools and modalities and like community interaction to get at least somewhat close to one-on-one tutoring. And I think that's the big question, not just for these companies in India, but also for all these ed tech companies in the US as well. So Lambda School actually recently rebranded to Bloom Academy, I think,
Hmm.
as a
Yeah.
reference to this particular research finding, um, which might mean that they're switching to a model that involves more one-on-one tutoring. I don't know, or that they're at least cognizant of this very huge problem that it was just like it's hard to educate people. So this is so to kind of bring it back to the hiring space a bit. Like you set up the context for this in a very interesting way, right? One is there's tons of companies hungry for technical talent coming to India. And then within India, you have this like latent source of not quite activated technology people yet, right? That these are the outsourcing people. And then meanwhile, there's like this currently hired in and working in VC funded startups. Those are the people sort of like benefiting from the market dynamics the most right now, right? Does that sound right?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So then I guess the question is like, how much are these folks benefiting? So you mentioned, salaries have grown by like salaries have doubled in the past 2 years, right? Do you think there's a ceiling to that type of thing? Like, do you think at some point people will say, I don't care how much you pay me, I'm not going to work for your company? A ceiling for software engineer salaries, basically.
I see, I see. So a ceiling, like, okay, from the company side, right? Like how much are the companies
Well,
like
yeah, I'd be curious about that too. But I was thinking from the engineer side, right? Where people will say, I'm actually going to stay at this job, even though it's 25% less than what this other company is giving me, because I like other factors of the job.
I see what you mean. I think that the absolute numbers also matter here, instead of percentages. Like if someone's making, let's say, $20,000 and then they get a 25% raise, so that's $4,000 more. Well, then they might consider other factors, right? Um, on the other hand, if you're making 100K and you get 25% more, which is $25,000, then you view it as a lot more income coming in. But the thing is that at lower income levels in India, you're not seeing like 25%. Well, yeah, if you jump to another company, but if you jump to like a VC backed tech company, you're not seeing the 25% increase at all, right? You're seeing like a 2x increase. So, but I
Yeah.
think well, your question was like if you're already working at like a VC backed company, 100K, and you get a 25% raise at another company, yeah, then I think there is probably other factors that go in.
I'm almost trying to push you in the direction, which is like, I think that questions like work-life balance and greater mission and these other qualitative factors of a job kind of get obscured in a market where people are shifting like crazy, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
I
I'm
completely agree.
I'm just sort of
Yeah,
curious, do you see an end to that? Like, do you see an end to the shifting? Are we going to get to a point where people start focusing on the qualitative factors more?
yeah. So I mean, there's all these studies, right? That there's like a minimum like salary. I think it's $70,000 or something. Like above that, it doesn't like if you're making above that, then it doesn't like your happiness, day-to-day happiness is not affected that much by the more money you make because like all your needs are taken care of. I think that after you reach a certain point, and there's also a lot of benefits of working in the same company, right? You're getting growth. You've built a nice rapport with your colleagues, your management, and it might be better for your growth if it's a great environment for you, right? If you're thriving in that company. So I think the ceiling. So there's this trend, right, of especially in India, of jumping every 1 or 2 years. 1.5 years is like very normal to jump companies. I think in the US, it's that number is double. Like the average person moves jobs every 2.5 years or something. In India, it's like 1.25, something like that. After a certain point, you reach a point where you don't just want to jump every 1 or 2 years, right? um, you want to have more impact on your team, on your company. You want to grow more, either technically or in terms of management. So I think you do reach a point where you don't want to just keep jumping around for a pay raise. And I think different people have different numbers where they'd be like satisfied in. um, so one person might have that number be like, I don't know, $70,000. Another person might have that number as 150,000. Um,
Yeah.
but I don't know. I don't at this point right now. Um, I think the ceiling is the US average developer salary, right? I see that as the ceiling because above that, companies won't. Then at that point, companies won't want to hire. Um, one won't want to increase their salary further, right? Because then they could just hire elsewhere in the world. So
Right.
I think there is that hard ceiling.
This current market dynamic is complicating the brand image of Indian technical talent across the world, right? Where I think I wonder how it will affect the outsourcing companies to be affiliated with, like, to essentially get some free marketing out of the more top tier tech talent that's now floating around in India, right? And I think that, like, that it's interesting how the world will sort of perceive this and then might start shifting its hunger for tech talent to other countries, right? That are in an earlier and cheaper stage. So you mentioned Vietnam. Do you think that's what's sort of happening? Like, people are looking at India and saying, "This the prices here are crazy. I'm just going to go to Vietnam."
Yeah, that's happening. That's starting to happen with um, earlier stage startups and companies that are okay with remote, right? Fully remote. Yeah, it's starting to happen. Vietnam is one. The Philippines is another. Eastern Europe, yeah, right? Those are all great places to hire. So I think that's inevitable, right? I think eventually, you know, eventually in 20 years or whenever it happens, it'll probably be like border free. Like you can hire engineers anywhere and they'll probably cost um, the same plus minus 10, $20,000 a year.
What do you think is required to get us there?
You definitely need um, a lot more demand, right? I think it'll be a product of demand. If demand keeps on increasing, like more and more VC money into software, larger valuations, I think that's enough to that's an enough pressure to keep increasing salaries around the world because companies can afford it, right?
Then I think the follow up to that question is, why would the Philippines start charging more, right? So right now, let's say, like, the average Indian salary for a good engineer is 45,000 USD a year, right? And in the Philippines, it's 30,000. At what point does the Philippines average start sneaking up to India's, and then now, you know, early stage startups go looking for another new country that has lower prices?
That's a good point. Like at what point? I do think there's a limit to the um, there's kind of these tiers of engineering talent, right? Um, for whatever reason, there's these engineers who have more experience um, building these web applications or backends, that work that's relevant to startups. Right? This kind of talent will probably even out. Like, if you're hiring the person with similar experience in India versus Philippines, companies will probably offer the same amount of salary. Like they'll be okay with it. But again, that depends on if the company is remote. So first of all, remote needs to become more and more prevalent, right? Hiring engineers remotely. One big thing that's driving Indian salaries is that India has a lot of local offices and they want people to come in. That needs to change a bit more over time. And the second thing is, I think, just developers learning more of these skills. So so yeah, it depends on if the demand grows faster than the supply or vice versa. Right now, like the demand is growing a lot faster than the supply, and it looks like it'll continue to happen because the speed of developers like learning these new skills seems to be slower than the demand. Um,
Yeah,
and
that
uh, and then to your point, like yeah, but won't you just find the next country? Um, I think it's going to be hard to do that forever. And we're already seeing that, right? We're already seeing limits to this. Like beyond these few countries we talked about, we're not seeing a lot of countries emerging as like freelancing hubs or engineering hubs.
there's this belief that you can kind of find the next cheap country with cheap labor that was falsified even in the physical manufacturing space, right? There was this belief that China will one day stop producing T-shirts, and then people will go to Kenya or will go to Bangladesh, and that's only in the T-shirt industrialization economy sort of prosperity flow. It was believed that like countries would eventually graduate from one form of manufacturing to another, to another, to another, and then get to the top and kind of just do this very, very complex manufacturing processes stuff. And that's not actually what we saw though in the past 10 years, which is that China still kind of dominates the just by its sheer size
Hmm.
dominates the physical manufacturing thing, and other countries haven't been able to kind of make their entry into the global market by making t-shirts and then jeans and then tents and more complicated stuff like that. They're not able to climb that ladder of economic productivity, and I'm wondering if something similar is going to happen on the software engineering side with India, where despite India being having only about 5% of engineers who are employable and it's having rising salaries, it's still producing so many engineers that people are kind of reluctant to go to another country, right? Or other countries simply don't have the infrastructure set up to feed such massive appetites for tech talent. And that's sort of what I'm just kind of curious to see in the next decade.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. That'd be very interesting to see. So, why do you think that other countries weren't able to catch up to China in t-shirt manufacturing?
So in specifically in physical manufacturing, there's some interesting tie tie-ins with software, which is that if you have a factory, you still need a manager. You still need somebody with an MBA who's willing to go run that place. And now as tech is booming, the MBAs don't want to work in t-shirt factories anymore. They don't want to work in pickle factories in like remote villages. They want to live in Bangalore. They want to work with the cool tech people. And so the average salary for a manager, whether in Kenya or in Nigeria, and I mentioned these two countries intentionally because they have growing tech scenes, the average MBA will earn more money by going into tech than by going into physical manufacturing, and will have a cooler life if they go into tech than if they go into physical manufacturing. And that pressure means that the cost of actually establishing a factory in these countries is higher than in China, where there are a bunch of MBAs essentially, or factory managers who are, for various reasons, mostly due to lack of internal mobility, are consigned to live in their particular province and to work there and to work in the closest thing to a fun challenge, which is a t-shirt factory or a jeans factory. And so it's all these other factors, and or specifically it's the desires of managerial talent, which I think are shaping a lot of these economic prosperity ladders these days.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, if it was a purely, free market where all countries were equal, do you think that, these other countries, Kenya, Nigeria, you mentioned, they would start taking more of the manufacturing business if everyone functioned, had the same policies, the similar
Yeah,
talent
if everyone had the same internal policies, I think
policies? Yeah.
that would be enough to do that, right? It's specifically that China has an internal like mobility restrictions and education and economic plans, which are very much designed to keep talent dispersed throughout the country, right? Managerial talent dispersed throughout the country, rather than concentrating all towards the economically prosperous East Coast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
hard to build it's very hard to build policies like that in other countries, right?
I think the equivalent of that kind of a hurdle would be companies not willing to hire remotely,
Mhm.
which in India, I still think most companies are not willing to hire remotely, right? Especially outside the country.
Yeah,
Um, so I think that could be an equivalent hurdle that other countries might face.
100%. Yeah, and I think that it will take time for companies to realize that fully remote companies are beating them at their game because they are fully remote and they're able to tap into this much wider network of talent, right? But it's going to take time for that to be the case. And there are some companies, I think, which would just have a very difficult time going remote, and they'll just have for various reasons that are sort of embedded in their culture or maybe even in their product. They require people to be kind of local. But I do think we'll see a lot more innovation from the companies willing to go fully remote.
Yeah, I think so. I think so, and especially in terms of talent, right? If I'm setting up a fully remote company, yeah, like anywhere. I think the time zone thing is somewhat of a factor nowadays. Like some
Mhm.
companies, they want, plus minus 5 hours of difference, um,
Yeah.
like within 5 hours. But yeah, I think that would be amazing. Yeah, opening up.
Well, that's the dream.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And
Cool.
let's see.
Cool. Thank you for coming on, Harsh. And yeah, let's next time we can discuss things about how people are innovating in the hiring space itself in Asia.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.
Yeah, thanks.